Okay, everyone. I think everybody can hear the Can you hear my voice? If everyone actually knows what we are doing, where we left on the 13th of March, actually we are trying to continue from where we left in these 40-minute meetings. In this Zoom application, since it is my first time. Where I try to actually continue I think, did everyone knows me or hear me on what you can see on the whiteboard? Since it is my first time to use this Zoom application and we have 40 minutes, I think it will be some kind of a trial and error system until we smooth out the operation. And if there is a problem, you can, I think, send me through this chat room application in here. We are actually talking about the major developments in transnational production. So what are these major developments in transnational production, especially the technological change? Since 1970. And I also, in the future, I try to give you information if I can record these short video feeds in another channel. And you, for example, if you could miss the live presentations afterwards, for example, you can get the band feed afterwards. I don't know in which application, but I will try and I will send you an email about that information also. Especially the production becomes cheaper. And more cost efficient. So when you look at all these kind of developments in transnational production since 1970s, why actually some of the global corporations or the future transnational corporations actually choose to produce in a transnational way or try to send their factories, for example, to East Asia and other places, because the cost efficiency, especially the cheap labor resources, in other parts of the world, actually Southeast Asia and China in here were probably priorities of these transnational corporations in sending their factories and production lines to these kind of countries. And also when they found these cheap labor resources, they can also send or re-export what they produce to the advanced capitalist countries since 1970s. So also they try to surpass national barriers with this transnational production. What these transnational barriers are, for example, most transnational corporations generally use these as a bargaining tool against the nation state. If you cannot hear my voice, try the Chrome application. In Chrome, Google Chrome, they said it will actually work better in terms of other applications, but I am not sure. I am also new to this application. So also third world countries facilitated the production conditions to actually attract more foreign production and foreign companies. For example, in the 1990s, the peak of it is I guess, using the internet and World Wide Web. Why the internet and World Wide Web is the primary facilitator? Because this electronic flow of funds and electronic applications and internet trading, all of them, for example, greatly facilitate this capital flows from one country to another almost in minutes. So especially after the 1990s, speed up in the present day 21st century, we can easily say transnational production is much more cost efficient. Maybe you can say until the latest corona crisis or until the 2008 great financial crisis. But for most of the indicators until I guess, at least until 2008 great financial crisis, we can clearly say the cost efficiency and cheap labor was a primary attraction for transnational corporations and why they became transnational. Because since 1970s, they saw the regulations, production conditions, for example, or labor costs in the advanced capitalist countries like United States and others, mostly actually too expensive for global competition. Especially, for example, the trigger came from American corporations. Why American corporations actually started this transnational production or this initiative compared to other countries? Because the especially German and Japanese companies since 1970s, they also greatly competitive against American corporations, and they actually increased this their competitive power. For example, one of the side effects of opening American market to their Western allies and Japanese allies, it backfired in 1970s, and one of the reactions of American corporations to this kind of new competition in the 1970s was to actually export their production lines to the third world countries. And China became a new source. As I said, internet trading and shopping through World Wide Web was also another facilitator, as I explained like 5 minutes before. Also, I don't know, I cannot see clearly how many people actually can able to see me or watch this live video feed about the international political economy class. But every Wednesday we will continue do this through this Zoom application, because our class is elective and less than 25-30 people. The university actually doesn't open up this distance learning system for classes under 25 people. So they argue that through this Moodle applications, we have to continue the classes either through this Zoom application or through another application. So this is the most convenient way we can teach lessons to the, or we can reach to the students until a further notice. So also to remind you, I don't have any necessary or definite information about the midterm exams or the issues like the finals. I think University Senate decided those kind of questions, and they will notify you about the possible dates, if they can postpone or how they regulate these midterms and other exams. So if you have those kind of questions, I will try to consider the readings first, because there is some kind of an inequalities coming from the nature of this online applications and online resources. So try to focus much more on the readings, because I'm not sure how many people can reach or access to this online education systems. So in order to save some kind of a fairness and create equality among students in the final exams, I try to consider these kind of difficulties when we give the final grades. Also, I think it is my first time in this Zoom classroom, so I guess in order, if you have any questions during the meetings, you can ask me through this chat room application or chat room feature. I am not sure how it works, but maybe you can see it through these Zoom applications. Or if you cannot reach me through any by any kind of means, you can send me an email and I can try to answer your questions. This internationalization also facilitates the international financial flows. Well, how they facilitate the international financial flows? Because capital controls by countries either lower it or altogether they erase these capital controls. So what we can say is international financial flows actually sped up after the 1980s, and especially, as I said, through this electronic pound trading in the year 2000 and afterwards. Also, what we can write about international finance is growth of new financial instruments. These generally also facilitate this international financial flows, outflow or inflow of capital from one country to another. A lot of times people generally call these flows hot money portfolio investments. Why they call it hot money? Because it can easily change its destiny or destination from one country to another. So you cannot be sure about the actions of these short-term capital flows and their possible effects on national economies. So one of the side effects of this international financial system is this. What are these new financial instruments? For example, maybe we can discuss these in detail in the chapter 8 on global financial system. But to give you some kind of a short summary, derivative, option, and forward markets were actually founded after the year 2000, and especially by Wall Street and City of London, by these new financial managers. So what we can say about these new markets is they are some kind of a secondary derivative and optional trading instruments. I will give you some kind of a much detailed information about these kind of option and forward markets in the financial section, since this will take too much time for us if we focus on these new financial instruments. We can just summarize right now. So in terms of the political factors since 1980s, if we look at the political factors since 1980s, the most states generally accepted neoliberalism. And this, when most states accepted neoliberalism, they actually somewhat accepted the Washington Consensus, all those neoliberal free trade, free market ideology that we discussed in earlier classes, if you remember from the first chapters of your textbook, or what is the neoliberal attitude regarding the international economy and about capitalism is. So free trade and free markets generally created the best possible allocation of human resources, according to the neoliberals. So they actually argued for a less government intervention and almost non-government intervention in economies, and also complete liberalization of these systems of capital controls and capital regulations and regulation on most of the financial markets, because they said if every country actually accepts this free trade and free market mentality, I'm sure you've heard it a lot of times from me in the other sessions of this class, actually most of the time, if you accept free trade mentality, most of the societal resources will be allocated perfectly according to the market competition rules. But there are also heavy criticisms of this neoliberal idea. But as long as you have a political and ideological power and economic power to support these ideologies across the world system, they are much more hegemonic. And you can say at least present day capitalism, we can accept neoliberalism is some kind of a major hegemonic ideology that affects people's perceptions, and at least politicians and ruling elites' perceptions regarding the international economy. So if we look at another topic of changing organizational principles. Economies in the 21st century, or in this global economy since 1970s, and what are these issues changing organizational principles? For example, one of them is merging of firms. What is this merging of firms in international politics and international economy? Merging of firms means collaboration by firms and unification of their power by actually selling their shares or buying other countries' companies' shares in international sense, and also create new transnational corporations or increase the scale of these transnational corporations by merging their power with different firms in the same sector. So it is much more an oligopolistic, we can say, change or oligopolistic markets that we see in the 21st century. What is oligopolistic markets means is actually oligopolistic markets 4 or 5 individual firms when they cooperate with each other in terms of, for example, cooperating with the price determination, labor conditions, or working conditions in a specific sectors. They can influence with their economic power buyer and seller behavior. For example, when they collaborate to adjust the prices and the markets, they can easily, for example, force consumers behave in a certain way. Because, for example, if you don't have that much option, let's say if there is a 5 pharmaceutical firms in pharmaceutical sector in your country, and if they decided to, for example, sell a basic, for example, a required medicine with a specific price, and if you don't have any other competition in your country against those 5 firms, for example, you have to buy that medicine from that specific price. That is a clear sample or clear example of this oligopolistic power over markets. And a lot of times we can see in the 1970s, we see this kind of development, and especially quickened or much more frequent in the 21st century. Patents and copyright laws, for example, that somewhat also change the international trade, especially in terms of, for example, intellectual copyright laws or patents. For example, it is very important in technological sectors and in healthcare sector. They may, for example, forbid foreign companies to use a patent product, or they can actually sue or somewhat prohibit other companies to use a certain invention or certain products through these copyright laws. So, for example, especially in third world countries, if you try to find, for example, cheaper drugs against these copyright laws or patent conditions in international trading system, a lot of times these Western financial and Western transnational corporations, for example, by using these legal rights, they can force you to end that generic drug production in pharmaceutical sector. So it is, for example, a clear and interesting example in terms of changing organizational principles since 1970s. Another issue is this production lines actually distributed around the world. What this production lines distributed around the world means is actually most of the time when you see these transnational corporations, they, for example, distributed and in optimum sense, in cost-efficient way, they organize the production lines. For example, let's say if you're an Apple executive and if you produce something in China and you can look for example, cheaper labor resources or cheaper raw materials. For example, you can direct your production lines to Taiwan, South Korea, or another kind of place according to those optimum guidelines, according to the cost efficiency principles. And most of the times, for example, most transnational corporations generally choose the most cost efficient ways to produce their products and commodities or their services. For example, most of the telecom companies use, for example, Indians as a call service occupants or call service people. Why they use these Indian people for North America and in Anglo-Saxon countries in call service? Because these kind of service sector prices were actually much more competitive and much more cost efficient for these companies if they actually send it to India. And through this internet connection, for example, you can be in Britain or United States, but when you call a company's call service, you can get the service from Indians, since they can speak English as if their native language. So that was the advantage of the lower working classes in India to work as a call service occupants in international economy. So mass production is replaced by individualized or customized commodities in international economies. What is this mass production and standardized production replaced by customized commodities? For example, in auto sector or in computer sectors. For example, when you go to their website, you can reconfigure your commodities when you buy something from these corporations. So it is some kind of a very important issue for most of the customers around the world and for most of these corporations. Why? Because generally people tended to, in all these shopping malls or in internet trading or internet shopping, these firms and companies generally try to individualize and also focus on the different tastes of customers. So they try to individualize or customize these commodities according to the different tastes rather than produce them in standard ways. For example, what is the advantage of this? They reduce the inventories in international markets because most of these products are customized or individualized. You generally buy them upon your demand. And before your demand, for example, there was no such product. It was created or produced upon the demand on the point. So that is, for example, right now, it creates some kind of a supply line challenges in this coronavirus days across the world economy, because most people doesn't have that much options in today's quarantine conditions. But since the 1980s, for example, most of these customized and no inventory production systems, because they get used to this individualizing the consumer products, right now we need, for example, urgently some very standard products like ventilators or medical products for emergency conditions. But the current international economy wasn't actually, most of the transnational companies were not actually oriented to that kind of production lines since 1980s. So it creates, for example, different challenges. What this customized no inventory production system, they called just-in-time production. Actually, this is just-in-time production was invented by Toyota, Japanese firm, and most of these transnational corporations actually followed that example of just-in-time production, that I give you some of the details regarding these corporations. And for example, another interesting and one thing we shouldn't forget is Africa was actually left behind as a major important issue. What are the changing organizational principles of international economy? Why Africa in terms of competitiveness was left behind? Because demand conditions among African population and the also individual pattern of consumption and also overall demand of these African countries were largely very small compared to, for example, other large markets across the world. So you can say deliberately most of the transnational corporations actually left the African countries and Africans behind. Okay, is there any questions so far about this, what we're talking in today's lecture? For example, joint ventures increased across the world. What is a joint venture? Is some kind of a cooperation between domestic and foreign firms, and generally larger Western foreign, especially Western or Asian corporations, when they create joint ventures with domestic companies. It is not a full-scale merger, but they can produce common products for certain sectors. And it was another way for transnational corporations to actually decrease this production costs across the international economy since 1980s. And mostly these distributors and importers across the world, for example, they also like these joint ventures because these distributors get a lot of advantages from these foreign firms, especially, for example, it increases or strengthens their hands competitively against their domestic rivals, for example, in international economy, and it is a significant issue in international economy. So in terms of this 40-minute lecture, if there is no another question, because they only gave me, I think, 40 minutes. And I also can give you, as I said, the information about email. If you have any questions, you can also send me the information and other questions, and we can continue where we left in the future sessions. I think until June, at least your university told me we will continue like this. Okay, hope to see you next time.